Okay, welcome folks. We're just gonna kind of give a few minutes for people to trickle in, but I just wanna thank you for coming to this webinar. We've slotted 90 minutes for this conversation. If we don't take up the whole time, then we'll log off early, and we do have a little bit of wiggle room for folks who if they have more questions. So thanks for coming. I just wanted to quickly, quickly introduce myself. So my name's Megan Kay. I am the outreach coordinator for the Living with Fire program. Looks like we have a few folks not able to access the Zoom. Just got an email. I'll do my best to kind of like respond to any tech related questions as we go. But for now, I just want to get through the introduction. So yeah, my name is Megan Kay. I work for the Living with Fire program. I have been helping facilitate a few grant writing workshops this year for communities in Nevada, mostly in Nevada. And so this is the third offering that we've done. We did one grant writing workshop at our Fire Adapted Nevada Summit, which happened in February, where communities got together and they kind of identified needs. We did a second one back in May, which was a more in-depth, like half-day workshop with communities. And then this is our kind of third offering, which is more open-ended. We really wanted folks to just come with questions that they had. And we have our expert guest, Donald Lovejoy, on. He's the grant coordinator for Nevada Division of Forestry. So you'll be able to pick his brain about all of your grant related questions. Before I introduce Donald, we are going to do a quick poll. So Gigi, would you mind launching that poll? Being assisted today by Gigi Bukakio. Did I pronounce that right? I hope I did. She's our awesome student worker here at Living with Fire. If you have any questions, feel free, you can message us directly, but if you have any like tech related questions, feel free to message Gigi directly and she'll try to help you with that. Okay, so while we're working on that poll, I just want to remind folks that Living with Fire is a University of Nevada, Reno extension program. We are an equal opportunity institution, and we receive federal funding, so we want to make sure that all of our programs are accessible to all. So if you are interested in attending any of our programs and you ever need any sort of accommodation, feel free to reach out to us and we'll try to accommodate your requests. But that's something that we want to make sure that people are aware of. We're doing our pre-survey right now. And so while we're doing that, I'll just kind of go back to the introductions. I already introduced myself. I'm going to hand over the floor to Donald. Donald, you want to unmute and introduce yourself?
Hey, good morning, folks. Happy to be here to talk about grants with you all. As Megan said, my name is Donald Lovejoy. I'm with the Nevada Division of Forestry. I am the Community Wildfire Defense Grant Coordinator. We have a few grant coordinators within NDF, and we have quite a few different grant programs available for everyone, for your communities. But I mostly work on the hazardous fuel side of our grants. So any sort of hazardous fuel, wildfire grants, hopefully I can help answer any questions that you all might have today.
Awesome. And thank you, Donald. Donald's been a great partner in getting this information out to folks and just being available for communities and fire protection districts and departments who are navigating this grant process. So we're really grateful for Donald's participation. Okay, so that's the end of my slideshow, my brief little introduction. I'm going to stop sharing. Looks like we have, that poll's been up for a bit. Looks like most people have participated. So we're going to go ahead and end our pre-poll. And then afterwards, we'll do a post-poll. So you'll still, if you weren't able to fill that out, it's okay. You'll have another opportunity to make your voice heard. So Donald, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Yeah, and I don't know, Megan, where what you said about this, but we did a few grant writing workshops earlier this year, and I know one of the things that we constantly get questions about are budget questions. So, anything on the budget can be a little bit complex, but we can definitely answer any that you all might have. When it comes to hazardous fuel grants, I'll also say that the ones that we work on primarily with the Nevada Division of Forestry are for the U.S. Forest Service. So these are federal grants. The three most common ones that we work on are called the Hazardous Fuel Community Protection Grant, the Western Fire Manager Grant, also known as the WUI grant, and then the Community Wildfire Defense Grant. So those are the three that we often work with communities on. That's not exclusive. There's a lot of different grants that are out there for folks, but those are kind of the ones that we really have that we support communities in applying for. And so, yeah, I can continue to share more. It looks like from the poll that some of you guys had some experience with grants. So I can share a little bit more background on them, or if we have any questions, we can jump into those as well.
Yeah, so this reminds me of one sort of housekeeping thing that I didn't address at the beginning. So so I'll circle back to that. So the way that the Q&A will function is if you guys have questions ready to go, feel free to just type them into the chat. If you aren't comfortable typing, you can raise your hand and just we'll call on you to speak. So just don't be shy. Let us know what your questions are. I do have a few sort of questions to get the conversation rolling. And so you talked about those different grants. Can you kind of briefly go over who's eligible, like what kind of organizations are eligible for applying for these grants for folks who aren't totally familiar? Oh, and we got a good question for you after you answer this one.
Yeah. So it kind of depends. There's some eligibility requirements that can be tied just to a particular grant program. But overall, the three that we focus on with our hazardous fuel program, the first one is it has to be an eligible organization. So that's usually some local, state, or tribal government. You can also be a nonprofit, such as a homeowner association. Say homeowner associations are probably one of the most common ones that we hear from, but it does have to be an eligible entity. If you are just like a homeowner and maybe not associated with a larger organization, that's kind of where you might want to look into, if you do have a larger community, or if you have your fire department or fire protection district, those are all good entities to reach out to and ask about how you can kind of support your community with wildfire mitigation. So eligible entity is number one. Number two is what type of project that you're kind of interested in. So as I said, the Nevada Division of Forestry does have a lot of different grant opportunities. So just because your project or your community need might not align with our grants, we can kind of talk through what your ideas are and figure out, if there is one that we have here in the state that might align better with what your needs are. When it comes to hazardous fuel grants, one of the most common project that people want to look at to fund is around reducing hazardous fuels, maybe making a fuel break or fire break around your community, maybe remove some of that vegetation around the community to kind of reduce your fire risk. That one is pretty much, can be used for any of our grants, that type of project. The one thing that we have to look at is land ownership and land permission. So landowner permission. So if it's anything on federal land, that's usually unallowed with our grants. So it does have to be some sort of, government or privately owned piece of land. It cannot be federal. The other piece there is that, if it's not the land that you own, then we need permission from that landowner to do the work. So oftentimes that's working with the county Maybe it's working with other private landowners, especially if you're doing a field break or a fire break, that oftentimes crosses multiple property boundaries. So making sure that every single one of those property owners agrees to this work. Otherwise, if you have a chunk of, land that doesn't get worked on and it's supposed to be a field break, it doesn't really make it that efficient or effective if you can't do the full break. So that's where, we want to make sure that you all have the kind of that permission and go ahead before you start applying for grant funds. Those are probably the two biggest eligibility pieces. With the Community Wildfire Defense Grant, there is a requirement that the project is described in a Community Wildfire Protection Plan. So in Nevada, we have these CWPPs, usually at least countywide, if not city. There are some HOA ones as well. But usually the project has to be described adequately enough in that Community Wildfire Protection Plan to actually apply for a project. And basically the need there is to make sure that this is actually a high priority project for that community and that this would actually reduce the wildfire hazard. So that's kind of the background.
So, yeah, so I guess like how specific is that? So for example, is it just kind of like if within that community wildfire protection plan, if it says reduce hazardous fuels, can it be that vague, or does it have to be as specific as like targeting specific neighborhoods and communities?
Yeah, and this is I think a question that I get asked all the time, and I feel like I'm developing my answer as the Community Wildfire Defense Grant, for some background, is funded for the recent bipartisan infrastructure bill. So it really has only been around for 2 years now. And so each year they're kind of fine tuning it. So it's not to say that things are going to change in the future for round 3 or round 4 or future years. But right now, what the guidance says is that the Community Wildfire Protection Plan needs to be described, needs to have enough of description to where someone can basically put together a basic scope of work and basic budget. So that is what they're looking for. I will say that the Forest Service also recognizes that a Community Wildfire Protection Plan, the purpose of those is not to apply for grant funds. It's to be this collaborative working document to assess the risk of a community and to, identify mitigation strategies. So, obviously there's kind of that gray line there where recognizing it's not really used just for this grant program, but it does have this kind of requirement to have it described in there.
Yeah, because the project needs to be part of an overall strategy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a question in the chat of what grants cover goat grazing, so targeted grazing.
Yeah, I would say all of them can pretty much, the 3 that we work on can cover goats. I will say that, depending on what the treatment is for the area, I would say that usually what I've seen is usually the scope of work is in addition to goats. So usually it's not the only thing that you're applying for. Maybe you're creating fuel breaks or reducing some of the fuels for like mastication or other means or hand thinning. And then the goat is usually used for like maintenance or for a very specific area. So I would say all 3 of these can be used for grazing, but typically it's in addition to other types of actions to mitigate the fire risk.
So it's like one tool in an overall strategy. So
exactly.
Yeah, so then if I was applying for, let's just say, a community wildfire defense grant program and I wanted to do targeted grazing, would I also have to have a plan for like after the goats come through for maybe managing that fuel so that it doesn't grow back? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, and it's, every area in Nevada, and every like property might be a little bit different in what the recommendations are. And really, that's where getting a forester or your fire protection district or department involved can help maybe prescribe a treatment for your area to, be best suited for where you live and the type of vegetation that you have. But it can be definitely, as you said, Megan, a tool in the toolbox for folks to use.
Nice. Okay, so I think a lot of communities that I connect with are smaller communities. I know that not everyone in the room is from Nevada. I work primarily in Nevada. And so there's a lot of rural communities that are a little smaller. They don't have HOA boards. Some of them don't even have fire protection districts. Some, so they might just be working with the county. What does that look like? Kind of going about starting a collaboration on that level? Like if I'm a homeowner, what is there any advice as far as like the path to maybe getting an initiative like that started? Where should folks start?
I would say, if you are just a landowner, get support. It's myself and my colleague Barry Stone. We're kind of the two people at Nevada Division of Forestry that work on these hazardous fuel grants. And we're both, happy to talk to people and try to, figure out where you're located, who might be able to help, that sort of thing. But yeah, reaching out to us, we might have an idea of who in the area might be a good fit to connect with at the very minimum. And it's also something that the Division of Forestry also has crews. We have camp crews that also go out and mitigate and do large scale projects. We have a lot of equipment and for teams to do some of that work. So if it's something that we can't eventually identify someone that could actually come out and help, then maybe it's the forestry itself, division forestry itself, that could maybe do those types of projects. We would probably work with our foresters and ask someone to come out and kind of assess this area and make sure
Yeah.
that it meets all those qualifications too. But we're happy to kind of navigate that with you and figure out who might be best in your community to work with. So you could always just call us and talk through it a little bit with us.
Yeah, and so just to remind folks, these grants are yearly, right? They're annual grants. The deadline to actually apply is in the fall sometime. I don't think they've all been announced. But if you're in Nevada Division of Forestry, they have a deadline of July 15th to get your applications into Donald and to Barry, depending on which grant you're applying for, Barry Stone. And that to kind of be pre-screened so that Donald can do what he was mentioning of like looking at it and being, trying to assess if maybe you could team up with another community or have your project be part of an application for a fire protection district, things like, or a fire department, sort of things like that. So that's just something to put out there that this year that deadline is July 15th. I know that's coming up. So for folks who maybe are just starting this process or just getting interested in grants, what's like a feasible timeline, you think? Like if they're going to apply next year, should they?
And I would say, so this is kind of the background with the July 15th deadline. We really, in the past, our experience working with these grant programs is that we get contacted pretty late in the timeline for when we have to submit those applications. And so we're hoping that the July 15th will at least give people a deadline to get us something rough draft of their idea of their application, just so we can start working on it to hit those deadlines that we can't go past. We still are waiting on guidance from the Forest Service on when those actual due dates will be, but from year to year, the actual application process and the application itself looks pretty identical. There might be minor changes from here to there, but I would say if you're trying to do a project, you can do it as soon as you want, and we can take in and provide feedback year round. You just will have to wait until the next submission deadline, which is typically in the fall for us, but it's never too early. And like I said, that's probably the biggest shortfall we get is we get these last minute applications and we don't have a lot of time to work on them with you and kind of fine tune them. Barry and I are available to kind of be that for you, basically that tool to work with you. We can, we have other resources available. We can, basically talk through your ideas and figure out who might be best or what might be best suited based on your need. But getting early start is much better than a late start, because oftentimes it's usually the late submit applications that don't get funded. Usually it's the ones that have been in our that we've been working on for a longer period of time that are often the ones funded.
And are there resources other than workshops like this that we try to work with you on? Are there other resources for folks developing the application as far as creating a budget, maybe a list of contractors that they can reach out to, things like that?
Yeah, there's so I'll answer those two. Well, with the budget, it can be a collaborative piece. The whole application can be collaborative, working with the grant coordinator at NDF. We can provide feedback, we can provide tips, we can let you know kind of the areas where the application might need to be strengthened or questions that you might be missing on it. The budget can be challenging because oftentimes it kind of goes back to that language. Federal grants have a very particular language, like equipment. Their definition of equipment might not be your definition of equipment. And so there's a lot of those little expenses that it's good to know kind of exactly what you're thinking, because how they're actually defined by the Forest Service might be different than how you would define them on your own.
And this is something also I thought of. Well, first of all, let me check in. We had a question in the chat of how to contact the forestry department. So Patricia, if you're in Nevada, I put Donald's contact info. If you need any more info, feel free to message me in the chat. But I was going to say something that people don't always realize is that these grants are reimbursement grants, right? Like you don't get the money up front.
Correct. Yeah, and that's common with federal grants. Most of them are going to be on a reimbursement basis. The only real advance payment grants with the federal government are often large construction grants or research grants. Those are really the only two that I've seen. But with reimbursement grants, you can request reimbursement as often or as as frequent as you need to, but you do have to cover the kind of initial costs of the work. So a good example might be if you have a contractor coming out to do a field break, and that contractor is charging, let's say, $100,000 to do a 40-acre. I'm just making these numbers up, but like a 40-acre field break, then, depending on how that contractor is charging you, if they're doing it based on the acres or based on the total project costs, then you would have to pay that up front and then ask the state for reimbursement to cover that. So that can limit it, especially if you're a small homeowner association or a small nonprofit that might not have a lot of cash on hand to kind of cover those costs up front. But we can also kind of try to work with you as well on that a little bit if we kind of know what the situation is. And again, you can request reimbursement as frequent or as often as you need.
Great. We do have a question from Anne. Is there someone to do homeowner defensible space inspections to define the work needed?
Yeah, and that's often, that's a question that we get asked a lot too. And often the best resource is, again, your fire protection district or your fire department. They should be able to offer you a defensible space inspection. We do have some fire crews and fire team members on our staff that can also do it. It kind of just depends on where you're located and who might be best suited to do those. A lot of if you're in rural Nevada, a lot of the volunteer fire departments can also do them as well. So it doesn't have to be like a career fire department. It can be a volunteer fire department, often do inspections. And if, and a good point too on that with grant funding is one of the limitations with grant funds is that they can't be used on usually like a single property. Really, the intention of those grants is to help a community. So if you are just a single homeowner, and you're just trying to do some work around your property, grants might not be the best fit, but we can kind of help navigate with you with that. Oftentimes, like I said, they're looking for how best to protect an entire community. Maybe that's an entire homeowner association or an entire subdivision of a city or something, but usually the grants are looking for a larger scope of that.
Great. And then Patricia says, so she must be in Tahoe, says we work with North Lake Tahoe Fire Protection District on defensible space. So we have a link for folks who are in Nevada. We do have a link on our website, which I'll put in the chat, about finding your fire protection district. So just there's some contact information on there, and then you can kind of reach out to folks depending on where you live. If you're in other states, you might have to look that up by which county you live in. So some folks who live in an incorporated city, you would reach out to like your fire department. If you're in unincorporated areas, then it's probably a county fire department. Just that's kind of like a general rule of thumb.
And I see Anne's question too, if your fire district doesn't have a program like that, I would say reach out to us, the Division of Forestry, and we can help hopefully find someone either on our team or if we have contacts ourselves or with community. Like I said, it can depend on where you live, as Megan said, kind of who would be the best point of contact for that.
Yeah, there should be some statewide resources available. They might not be, it might not be able to come out right away, depending on where you live. But I know that, yeah, NDF has some resources. We're Living with Fire is working on adding capacity to that effort as well. So hopefully we'll get some folks able to, for people who don't have fire protection districts who do defensible space inspections. We can, I know that the Red Cross, it's not a defensible space inspection, but they do have a similar tool. So you can think about, you can maybe consider reaching out to the Red Cross too, because they do have like a hazard assessment tool. Let's see. Okay. If hopefully folks are thinking about questions to write in, but in the meantime, I just wanted to ask, what are some, I guess, common mistakes that people make that could easily be corrected when it comes to the grant process?
Yeah, definitely. I would say I already said this first one, but waiting till the last minute to apply can be really challenging. As I said before, like the more time we have to talk with you, Barry and I, on your grant proposal, the more time we can dedicate towards providing feedback and kind of tailoring it as much as possible. And getting an early conversation with us can also help, because we covered some of the basic eligibility, but it can go a lot deeper depending on what the situation is and what you're trying to do. So it can help to go and talk through kind of the need and what your project is, to make sure there's no question about eligibility, or if there's other aspects to it that might either increase or change the scope of work, that can be helpful too. Like a good example is depending on the estimate of how much your project is going to cost, that will really play into what grant opportunities are out there, because some of them are pretty limited by the maximum amount of money you can apply for. Whereas like the Community Wildfire Defense Grant, you can apply up to $10 million in hazardous fuel projects. So $10 million is a lot of money, but there are maximums and some other limitations that we'd have to talk through. Another one is match. So most of our grants require some sort of match. With communities, an easy way to capture that match might be to do like educational events or do volunteer cleanup days and things like that. So there are ways to get like in-kind match attributed towards a grant, but that's also kind of a thing to think about early on is how you're planning to cover that match requirement.
Yeah,
And
doesn't match is something that does anybody have any questions about match? I kind of want you to unpack match a little bit. Like how much match do some of the grants require? And what exactly is match?
yeah, so I can kind of start, and yeah, if anyone has any questions, I can cover those as well. But let's talk about the Community Wildfire Defense Grant. So for hazardous fuel projects, those are going to be your treatments, your fuel breaks, those sort of things. There is a 25% match requirement, which basically means the federal agency, the Forest Service, only really wants to put in 75% of whatever the total cost of the project is going to be. They expect that there's going to be some non-federal funds coming in to support the project, and for that up to 25%. With some of Barry's grants, it's usually 10%, or it kind of depends on the type of grant as well, 10 to 50, basically like a one-to-one match. Communities can meet that either by cash in kind, or for some limited instances, we can use what's called fire over match. So for cash match, that would be obviously putting direct money into the project. Maybe it's getting a grant for a contractor to do work around the community, and the total cost of the grant is going to be, the total cost of that contractor is going to be $200,000, for example. And let's say, you want the grant to cover $100,000, and then your HOA or your community is planning to put in another $100,000 to make up the total cost of that contractor to do the work. So that would be like a cash example. You guys are providing direct money, direct funding to support the project. The other one would be in-kind match, which is more of like a soft match, is kind of what it's referred to. And that would be things like volunteer hours. And so you can count the amount of hours that you volunteer as part of that total match requirement. There's a few websites. Kind of the most common one is called the independent sector. And the independent sector, what they do is they actually figure out the estimated cost rate for volunteers. And so basically what you can do is each volunteer hour can be calculated with that rate to determine the total cost that you contributed as in-kind match. And then for NDF, the last one is called fire over match. And this one is kind of a complicated one to understand, and it's very limited by which grants we can use it for. But essentially, the Nevada Division of Forestry, we have a fire suppression arm of our department or division. And so we spend a lot of money each year fighting fires out there in the state. And we can use some of that doesn't get reimbursed to us as match on some of these grant programs. And so the thing to know about that, the fire over match, is that it won't actually go directly to your project. It would just be counting to help with that match requirement. So it's a little complicated, a little confusing, but it's basically helping meet the requirement, but can't really be used for anything. It's just the the fire costs that we use every year
Mhm.
for suppression efforts. And then the other thing I'll say is for the Community Wildfire Defense Grant, you can actually apply for a match waiver. And so if you're a community that's underserved or low income, then you may qualify to not have any sort of match requirement on that grant.
So that was very insightful, informative. Hopefully for other folks too. Let's see. I was wondering about, I wanted to circle back to kind of like the paperwork required. So you're like, for example, you have to keep track of match. What kind, well, two questions. First part, how long are these grant periods usually for? So if you get like a CWDG grant, how long of a period do you have to actually do the work and spend the money?
Yeah, and that's a really great question. So all of our grants are usually funded for 5 years, but we tell people to plan for projects that can be done in 3 years or less. And the reason why we say that is because the Division of Forestry is basically acts as the pass-through entity for these grant funds. So basically meaning that the Forest Service will give us the funds and then we use those funds to pay you directly. That's typically a common kind of method for federal funds. Typically, they want someone at the state level to kind of be more of an administrator, more of the support for the state and the communities. So because we have that pass-through responsibility with these grants, we have some state processes that can take some time, upwards of 6 months to a year before we can actually start handing out funds to do project work. So we get funds for 5 years, but there's some state processes and some closeout at the end of the grant period that also takes some time. So 3 years is a good timeline to aim for. We recognize if it does take a little bit longer than 3 years, we can usually work with you, but realistically, 5 years is not usually what you actually have for on the ground work being done.
So is there any support for the documentation and the reporting for the grant? So like if a community receives a grant, imagine they have to report back as to like what's being done and keeping track of all those hours. Is there any support from NDF for communities on that, or do they just kind of have to figure out how to do that?
Yeah, we work with you throughout the entire lifespan of the grant. I will say that kind of goes back to your other question about what are common mistakes from people that they make in these grants. One of the most common mistakes as well is not being realistic in your application. Because basically, if your application is funded, you're being held accountable to what you wrote in your application. So don't put things in there that are unrealistic or that are unreasonable, because that's typically what you're going to be held responsible for achieving in that grant period. So some good examples are like the timeline. If you put a really tight 5-year timeline, that's not going to be realistic with our state processes. And so that's where it becomes where we often get projects that are kind of being rushed through to get completed on time. With the budget, if you're cutting yourself short because you're trying to fit within a certain amount of funds, that can also be a shortfall, especially if you're trying to do, let's say you're trying to do a field break, and the actual cost of that field break is going to be, let's say, $500,000, and you only budgeted for $300,000. Well, the Forest Service is still going to basically hold you accountable for getting that field break done, whether or not it costs $500,000 or $300,000. So it's really good to be realistic, kind of buffer some of that in your budget. Especially if your field break isn't going to happen for a few years, then you might want to consider putting a little extra buffer in there to support any inflation costs or any changes in what those estimated costs are going to be.
Nice. I'm curious for folks that are on this meeting or on the webinar, are any of you working on grant applications right now? If you are, feel free to raise your hand or something, because I'm just curious to know if you guys have any specific questions about your application. Feel free to ask. But I also wanted to point out that, you know, earlier we talked about if folks are wondering where to start in this process, a good place to start would be just to reach out to NDF to see what other applications are in process, but also a good place to start would be to reach out to either Fire Adapted Nevada, which is like our Nevada network of fire adapted communities, if you will. It's an initiative where it's a multi-agency initiative aimed at helping communities become fire adapted. And then also in Tahoe, there's the Tahoe network of fire adapted communities. So you guys can reach, and I'm gonna call out Michelle because she's on the call, but Michelle, if you wouldn't mind maybe dropping your info in the chat or something. These are excellent resources because the coordinators of both these programs are working with communities all across the state and all across the Lake Tahoe Basin. And so they might be able to connect you with some folks that are trying to do similar things. You know, when you are trying to get work done in your community, you might feel like you're in your little silo. It might feel daunting to actually start the process. So I think, yeah, a good place to start would be to reach out to your Nevada Division of Forestry. You can reach out to Living with Fire too. We work closely with all of the fire protection districts and the coordinators for the fire adapted communities. And we also have close relationships with a lot of communities as well. So feel free to use any and all of those resources. I'll send you guys a list of resources at the end, but I just wanted to kind of put a fine point on that, let you guys know that if you're just don't know where to start, that would be a great place to start. And then I also just wanted to give Donald a chance to highlight any other resources that Nevada Division of Forestry offers that could possibly help. Like, are there templates online that folks can download, things like that?
Yeah, and I kind of also want to say, like, the grant coordinators here at NDF, you know, they're here to provide answers, provide support throughout the entire process, right? So even if it's just a basic idea that you have, you know, we can talk through it a little bit more, maybe give some tips or guidance. The three grants we kind of have been talking about today, the HFCP, the WUI, and the Community Wildfire Defense Grant, all three of those are going to be competitive, right? So they're going to be bumped up against either nationally or like a 17-state region, basically like the Western states. And so it's not, you know, guaranteed funding for your community. It can be often challenging to go through the application process. And NDF, you know, once in a while, we will have funds or non-competitive funds that we can use for projects. It's really just based on what the needs are and does it align with what that funding is supposed to be used for. So there are other opportunities out there. There's other grant programs beyond these three. So we have some other resources out there when it comes to grant funding for your projects or for your community. Oftentimes, fire protection districts and fire departments also have other resources besides just grants, you know, like defensible space inspections if folks need those. We do have our fan coordinator as well, Nikhil. Some of you all might know him, but he can also do a lot of outreach and educational events. He would be our point of contact with the state to develop like Firewise communities, which is also a great start, especially if you live in a community that maybe is just starting to think about fire risk and are wondering what like a first step to maybe even just educate the community members on what to do, what not to do in their community, how they can get more involved. You know, reaching out to our fan coordinator can maybe get some good tips out there. We also have regional kind of contacts as well. So that kind of depending on where you are, we can put you in contact with someone more local. We have a fire program, we have our resource program. We have quite a few resources throughout the state and a few different offices. So we can usually try to get out and meet you as well in your community. It's not necessarily, you don't have to come to us in person. We can usually get out and meet with you as well in your community.
That's awesome. Gigi, would you mind launching the post poll? Yeah, so thank you guys for coming. We definitely have more time. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, or if you just want to have any comments too, feel free to unmute. But I think that we've kind of cycled through all of the questions that I wanted to have answered. So if there's no other questions, I think we'll start wrapping things up. So yeah, just a reminder, if you registered for this webinar, I'm going to send out a copy of the video. So this is being recorded. So we'll send out a copy of the video with transcripts. It takes usually a couple days to check that transcript. So don't expect it right away. It's going to be a couple days, maybe a week, but we'll send out just kind of follow-up email with the video and also a list of a lot of the resources that we mentioned and also some contact information that we mentioned. So we're not going to leave you in the lurch. We're gonna follow up with some resources. And if grant writing and pursuing these grant opportunities if you've decided this is not necessarily a path that you want to pursue, I highly suggest still connecting with Nikhil, the Fire Adaptive Nevada coordinator, connect with your local HOA boards and see if there's other ways that we can get work done. There's a lot of other opportunities. And we've got Anne Grant on. She's raising her hand. I'm going to go ahead and kind of give her the floor. She's very experienced. She's a great community leader. So Anne, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just curious. We're a really small HOA. We have 39 homes. We're adjacent to Saratoga Springs, which has 300 some homes, I believe. Our association, our common areas, our only common area is a walking trail, which we did mastication there last year through a grant with NDF. But our interior, there's a lot of homes with really bad vegetation, especially in the front yard. And then our HOA, the common area is around the streets and the sidewalks. And they're all full of juniper and whatever. So I just want to know, where's the best place to start with a grant for doing some of that work?
Yeah, and I know that's one of the challenging things too as well, right? Like sometimes you can get funding for certain aspects of your community to protect it, but then maybe there's some other further needs that need to be handled. And so I think we can talk through it more and kind of figure out exactly what type of the scope of work would be and how much the total cost of that would be. If you've had contractors give estimates for the work or anything like that, that might be a good place to kind of know, because that will kind of factor in what type of funding will be out there and available for it. But yeah, we should definitely talk through it a little bit more.
Yeah. Could somebody come out and just walk? We have 5 streets in here. Just walk with me and look at it and tell me what's the best direction to proceed.
Yeah, and do you remember what type of grant you had before? That might be a good place to look at too.
We had the Indian Hills grant.
Okay.
Saratoga Springs, and we participated in that. We participated with Saratoga Springs.
Okay. Yeah, let me see, because I know, I don't know, I think the forester that's been working on that project, Bill Buckley, he's probably a good one to talk to as well. So I can follow up and see. I don't know if you've already talked to him about it, or if you guys have. any-
I mentioned it to him last year, but not really since.
Okay. And I don't know if I have your contact information, but I know Megan shared it. So if you want
Mhm.
to reach out to me, we can maybe go from there.
Okay,
I can connect you guys after.
Okay.
Okay.
And I
The
also, Megan, can I also make a plug? Because you mentioned something that reminded me of something else.
Mhm.
I published the website link for our grants page for NDF. That will take you to the list of all the grants that are kind of ongoing and regular ones that we work on. Again, not to say they're the only ones that we have, it's just the ones that that are the most common ones that we work with. If you click on the type of grant program on the right-hand side, it will also show you the contact information for that grant. So that's a good place to look and see kind of what grant might align with your community needs, and then it'll show you the contact information for that grant coordinator, so you can talk to them directly about it. Hazardous fuel grants is going to be either myself or Barry Stone, but there are some other folks on our team that deal with grants too. So
you actually jogged my memory about another question, which I never followed up on, which is a list of contractors. So in order to get these huge projects done, I mean, is there a list of preferred contractors or we have like a list of contractors that have done our defensible space training on our website. So folks who are just trying to get work done around their houses. Some of those contractors might be able to handle bigger jobs, but most of those folks are more like landscapers or arborists, landscape design. I don't think they have like heavy equipment like masticators. So like, who would you call to get that work done?
yeah, and this is a good question. So I'll say three things about it. The first one is we do have a state vendor website where you can go and see at least some of the vendors that are on the states, basically that we might have master or service agreements with. So that might be a good place to look at. If you're just looking for, a project to be done with your own, funds, or, with maybe a homeowner association fund, it's probably worth checking in with some of the other like nearby communities to see if they use anyone in particular, or, to get to kind of see who's local. But if it is going to be a grant funded project, I will say that usually we're going to want to see some sort of like bidding process, so that it is kind of a fair and a fair process to who you're actually selecting as to do the work.
Gotcha.
So that's something we can kind of talk for a little bit more, but usually there is kind of like a state bidding process that we kind of put on our sub awards to look at for when they are doing grant funded projects.
But they don't necessarily have to have that in the application, right? They just have to have like a budget. So they have to have gotten quotes.
Yes, yeah, and that's where, reaching out to, if there's other HOAs in the community, you could see who they work with, or if you've people in the past, you might be able to get them to do like an estimate for you. There's also the national NCRS website. They have, I'm trying to think of what the name is, but they basically every year they have this data that they release that kind of has certain types of treatments, and basically like a cost per acre that's kind of NCRS. I'll see if I can find the website and maybe send it to you, but there are some like online sites where you can go to and see kind of general estimates. That's not to say the cost is going to be identical. It's going to be dependent on the type of vegetation and, the slope of the terrain. If it's can get heavy machinery like masticators out there to do the work, or if it's all going to have to be hand thinned. There's a lot of elements to that can kind of change the cost per
Do you
acre.
have to, when you're doing a budget, do you have to like state where you got the estimate from? Like if you get it from this NRCS calculator? can you, or in CRS, can you like, do you have to state that this is where I got this information from, or do you have to like list quotes?
It's not part of the requirements for the grant application to
Okay.
say where you got the estimate from, but you should have at least a little bit of a description in there to explain what the cost is. So is it per acre? Is it based on the treatments? How is that cost being determined? And I would also say that whenever you're dealing with estimates, always know that, you're going to be held accountable to that, because if you're asking for $100,000 to do, 100 acres and you get the grant, you're only going to get $100,000, even if the cost ends up being more. So it's really important to be as accurate as possible there, and maybe even buffer a little bit for unexpected costs that might come out. So it's really important to be as accurate as you can on that.
Great, awesome. Okay, I don't see any more questions in the chat, so this is your last chance to ask Donald a question. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up then, and then just say thank you, Donald, for answering all of our questions. I learned so much. Hopefully you guys did, and go ahead and look out for that follow-up email. And yeah, hopefully everyone has a good rest of the day.
Thank you
Yeah.
all for taking the time to listen. I know it's
Yeah, exactly.
a lot of
We're gonna-
information. So
Yeah, we're gonna be, Living with Fire, we put on a lot of educational opportunities for communities. So if you guys aren't already, subscribe to our email list or follow us on social media so that you guys can stay up to date and to everything that we're offering. But yeah, thanks for coming. And I guess we'll hopefully see you guys at the next one.